So I've been thinking a lot about leadership. And I've been thinking about the role of libertarians in leadership. I believe that leadership requires two contradictory things. It requires an overarching vision that you have the confidence and the competence to put forward and work to advance. But it also requires the modesty to understand that the way you're going to work for that vision is through tiny decisions, one after the other, and that from every decision you're going to learn something. And that something you learn might very well change that overarching vision. So leadership involves also this openness to learning from experience as you lead. And it also requires the willingness to take that vision, which for most of us is an international vision, a vision of a better world, and bring it down to a workable level. I'm advocating running for local office, not only because local offices are more winnable, and not only because I believe you can build the party from the bottom up more easily than from the top down, but also because governing at the local level is really important. And you can use those global level concerns you have at the local level. I'm a planning commissioner in a small town. I have global level concerns, and I bring them to that position. And I'm going to illustrate two ways. First way is very easy to illustrate. I bring my opposition to corporate welfare and my defense of private property to every decision that comes in front of that board. And I ask two questions of myself each time I need to make a decision. Number one, what path best pursues justice and equity for the person in front of me? And number two, what path sets the best public policy and best pursues those visions over a period of time? Okay, so that's the easy way to picture it. I also have a more complicated way to picture it that I'd like to share with you as well. But to do that, I want to take a step back and go back to this question of leadership. Okay. And I want to look at one particular leader who told us where he took his inspiration from. Because I think, whether you agree or disagree with him, and I disagree with him in many, many ways, that understanding that process of what he did to translate the clarion call to leadership and service that he heard and turn it into actual governance is important for the members of this party. And is important if we want to be a serious party that takes seriously the responsibilities of governance and public policy. So let's look at what Bill Clinton says about his influences. He says he first heard the clarion call to service from John F. Kennedy, and it was then refined by his professor, Carroll Quigley. I'll come back to Kennedy, but what did Quigley say? I don't know, I wasn't in the class. But I do know what Quigley says in Tragedy and Hope. By the way, an excellent book. I recommend it. He doesn't say what to do if you happen to find yourself the President of the United States. He doesn't clarify the clarion call in that way. He doesn't say, here's what you should do if you were president. He lays out the life cycle of a civilization. He tells us a civilization begins by picking up the scraps of a previous civilization. So a society, a group of people find the artifacts and the leftovers of some previous culture, and they blend those into a new culture. And they expand from the core out to the periphery. And there's a lot of technical elements that come in here. For example, the ideology doesn't spread at the same speed as technology will spread from the core out to the periphery. The consequences of all these types of considerations are eventually the core enters into a period of decay and gets taken over by one of the peripheral nations, one of the peripheral parts. If the center of Western civilization is Europe, and the United States is one of those peripheral pieces, we have entered the period in history where the periphery takes charge. This is followed, he says, if the society does not die, by a period of universal empire, and followed by decline. And he issues a call. He says, Western civilization has been unique, in that it's gone through the cycle, but didn't die at the end. It went through it again, and again, and again. And so his clarion call is, keep Western civilization alive, because Western civilization is unique. And what's unique about it, and this should resonate with us libertarians, even if we don't agree with the details, is the respect for the individual and the humanistic values. He also talks about the religious aspects, but in particular, he says the religion is translated into individualistic terms in the way that other cultures did not translate it. So his focus is on the fact that Western culture cares about the individual and cares about these humanistic values and translates Judaism and Christianity into those terms. Judaism, he tells us, grew from a Canaanite religion, but the Canaanite religion didn't have the individual focus that Judaism ended up having, because that was the impact of passing through this cultural vice, so to speak. Is vice the right word? Passing through the culture of Western culture. And that's what Bill Clinton heard. And that clarified the call to service that he heard from John F. Kennedy into a course of action. It taught him, he says, how to actually govern, what specific acts to take. So now I want to turn to another aspect of land use governance that I think is really important. And this is one of those reasons that I think it's really important to have libertarians in these local offices, particularly land use offices. I believe that land use law has led to the decline of the mixed-use neighborhood, and as a result, it's built a situation that the whole country is becoming very familiar with, not just libertarians. We've talked about it for a long time, but now other people are waking up to it. After Ferguson, after the Justice Department report on Ferguson, people are waking up to what I call nickel and dime tyranny, which I believe is aided and abetted and in fact made possible by land use law in particular. The decline of mixed-use neighborhoods means you must have transportation to get to and hold a job. But it happened without an increase in the availability of public transportation or mass transportation of any sort, which means you rely on the car. And the government takes a fee for your driver's license, and they take a fee for your registration, and they require you to take out insurance. If you just spend everything you have on that car, and you can't afford the fee, and you can't afford the registration, you can't afford the driver's license, you also can't afford not to work. So what do? You drive without. And if you're a person of color, you're going to get pulled over more often than a person not of color. And if you drive a cheaper car, you're going to get pulled over more often than a person with an expensive car. But we've gone beyond that now to where the police departments are even buying license plate scanners to catch those unregistered cars. So what's happening is the people who can least afford these fees are the ones getting hit with them. You hit a middle class person, the $200 fine, it's annoying. You hit a rich person with it, it's not a big deal. You hit somebody on the bottom rung of society with that, you've dug a hole they can't get out of. And this is built, as I said, nickel and dime tyranny, where the people at the bottom of society, every time they turn around, face another fee, another fine. And I sat in Middletown in traffic court, and I listened to the cases that came in front of that court. And I heard a woman come in and say she can't pay her fine, just like she couldn't pay it the last 3 times she was there. And furthermore, she said, I lost my job because I missed work 3 times to come here and tell you I can't afford to pay my fine. And the judge said, well, if you couldn't pay it then, you certainly can't pay it now. You can go to jail in lieu of paying the fine. Did that advance justice? No. But it supports a system. It supports a system of revenue farming. The same system that the Justice Department identified in Ferguson, but it's not just in Ferguson. We've let ourselves be distracted by the racial elements which were there and real, but weren't the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter was revenue farming, and it's not just in Ferguson, it's everywhere in this country. But Ferguson serves as a very good focal point and rallying cry for it. We are funding our public goods and services on the backs of those who are least capable of paying for them and least likely to actually make use of them. But the reason for that is because we're in a bind. What's the alternative if you believe the government must provide those goods and services? You can do it on the backs of the poor through this fine system, or you can do it through taxes on those who managed to succeed. And you can chase away the jobs and push the jobs even further and increase the need for transportation and increase the cost and make it even harder. So either way you go about it, you've made economic mobility harder or impossible. And this has had a genuine impact on economic mobility. This is the type of issue where we have the answer. Their answer has led to failure, iniquity, injustice. We know how to govern on this issue in a way that they do not. And you can clarify that message. You can make that message to the voters. This video is going to be 15-20 minutes long. It's your job to take that message to the voters in 30 seconds, and you can do it. And I know you can do it because I did it. I did it at hundreds of doors in my town. I made that message while I stood on the doorstep. They call it the elevator or doorstep pitch. But you have to do it your way, a way that works for your personality. Another part of this tyranny by nickel and dime is something that Sonia Sotomayor identified really well in her dissent in a recent Supreme Court verdict in Jaén, where they decided the police can make a mistake of law, pull you over for something that's not actually a crime, use that to justify a search, and not exclude evidence that's found during that search. In this case, they found cocaine. Now, of course, it's easy to say, well, cocaine should be legal. But that wasn't the case. That wasn't what the case was about. The case was about, can they pull you over if you didn't break the law? And 8 justices said yes. And Sotomayor said no. And her reason for saying no was the court's verdict, as well as the concurring opinion from Kagan, were very much technical legal issues and relied on a test of reasonability. They said, is it a reasonable mistake or isn't it? And she said, how do you administer that principle? It simply does not set up an administratable test. It does not set up a test where the citizen knows when he can be expected to be seized and when he cannot. And what's more important than getting it right is getting it procedural, getting it administratable. What's more important than the fact is knowing what you can expect. And I think that's something that we libertarians can also appreciate. That your interactions with government should not be unpredictable. And we can fight for that and make that happen at the local level. And we can take our grand global vision and make it real. Maybe for just a few people. But for those people, it means the world. So let's turn now to the first part of the clarion call that Bill Clinton heard. I like to imagine this is the speech he heard, but I'm not going to do the Massachusetts accent. What kind of peace do I mean, and what kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave. How many people died in interactions with police last year? That is part of the cost of building a system that funds all or a large portion of our public goods on the backs of the poor. A lot of dead black and poor citizens enjoying the peace of the grave. Or the security of the slave. What is the security of the slave? What better illustrates the security of the slave than using your security apparatus, your police department, as a revenue stream? What better illustrates the idea of not chattel slavery, but modern day revenue farming slavery? The security of the slave. The person who every time he tries to advance his position in life gets shot down and put into a deeper hole where he owes more money that he can't afford to pay at the hands of those who are entrusted with his security. I am talking about a genuine peace. The kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living. The kind that enables men and nations to grow into hope and to build a better life for their children. Men and nations. You see, we build a vision for man first, and the nation follows, and then nations follow. But you free one person first, and for their children. It's one thing to say we're going to fight for a better world for ourselves, or for a hypothetical future that we don't quite know about. But the emotional impact of saying for our children changes everything, doesn't it? It changes the focus, especially for a libertarian. until you hear that phrase, for their children, it's easy for the libertarian to focus on the purity of their viewpoint, rather than making actual advances that actually make people freer, but might require the sacrifice of a little bit of your purity. But for your children, you'll sacrifice it to make the world just a little bit better for them. As I said, you free one man, you free the nation, you free nations. You make the world better tomorrow. And then the next day it gets a little bit better. The next day it gets even better than that. But to do it, you have to sacrifice a little bit. You have to compromise a little bit. You don't compromise your beliefs, but you compromise by holding office. By not spending every second in office shooting yourself in the foot, by pushing for the most radical position you can find, but by doing what you can to advance freedom in a way that works. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. You see, we all share the same vision. And Western culture is about the primacy of the individual, according to Carroll Quigley, and humanistic values. It lends itself to a denial of exceptionalism. It lends itself to the view that we don't pursue freedom just for a few, but for everyone. We don't pursue a better world only for Americans on the backs of others any more than we pursue a better world for some on the backs of the poor. For all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. And here's where Sotomayor and the importance of administrative and procedural justice, I think, comes into play. How do we secure peace not just for the moment? How do we secure freedom not just for the moment, but for all time? I believe we do it by setting up institutions that can be trusted to deliver it. I can secure freedom for right now through an exceptional act. But to secure a lasting peace in the sense of John F. Kennedy, I have to reach further. I need to set up institutional structures that are geared around civic participation and cooperation, because that's the only other way to deliver those common goods that we need. We can deliver them through government on the back of the poor, through government on the backs of the successful, and chase away the jobs. Or we can in some way deliver them through civic engagement and cooperation. And that might very well be through a market structure where somebody's making money off of it. Uber is a cooperative endeavor. Airbnb is a cooperative endeavor. Or it might be a more directly cooperative system at the local level. Either way, we have to do it outside the government, because the only way the governments can do it are in ways that have tremendous costs in terms of economic mobility, in terms of keeping people on the bottom. Okay? The case for free markets is not that it's good to have iniquity. The case for free markets is that the government produces more iniquity than the market can. That the government holds down the poorest and lowest in society and tells them every time you try to take a step up, we're going to push you 2 steps down. Not merely peace for our time, but peace for all time. We secure that through institutions we can trust, that are administratable, that are understandable. The whole issue with the reasonability standard was, how is the individual supposed to know what is a reasonable mistake? How ignorant can a police officer choose to be about the laws they enforce in order to give themselves more excuses to seize an individual in the language of the Fourth Amendment, is what she's asking. And the only answer is none. We can allow mistakes of fact because it's easy to put reasonability standards on mistakes of fact. But when you open the door to mistakes of law, how do you bind that by reasonability? How do you test if the police officer reasonably believed that a law was being violated? Unless the standard is, there has to be a law that the police officer reasonably thought was being violated. You see, and that leads to only accepting mistakes of fact. But it's an example of a much broader, much larger approach to the judiciary and to the practice of law that she's giving, where she's saying justice is primarily administration, primarily procedure. And that's how we take it from peace for our time to peace for all time. That's how we secure the blessings of individuality and the humanistic values that Carroll Quigley called upon Bill Clinton, and I'm calling upon you to lead and to defend. Not just by talking about them, but by taking an active policy role at the level you can reach, and at the level where you can reach other people. And figuring out how to translate those large goals into a small action every single day. And my suggestion is we begin with land use laws because of their disproportionate impact on the poor, because of their real social cost in terms of economic mobility, and the social costs of the loss of economic mobility, the violence in the cities, the desperation, the fact that police militarization begins to make sense to policymakers when police deal with increased violence from desperate people who know they have no chance to rise out of poverty. So why not take this chance? Why not escalate that encounter that leads to a trigger-happy police officer, that leads to a tragedy like in Ferguson? That's a large-scale issue. And yet I've boiled it down to the local level. And what do you say on the doorstep? I am going to fight for economic mobility and for the ability of the poor to rise up, and I'm going to do it by making sure there's access to jobs, and that every time you try to get to work, you don't face a fine from the government. And I'm going to do that by decreasing the government's reliance on revenue gained from the poor. And I'm going to do that by leading and inspiring civic engagement and market solutions. And that's a winning strategy. And that's where I believe we need to go. I hope you'll join me and become another one of the currently 144. And in the year, let's set the goal 400 elected libertarians holding office and every day moving policy in a libertarian direction. Thank you.